96% of American adults have relied on a major government program at some point in their lives, but somehow most of those programs benefit the rich. In fact, the richest American families receive almost 40% more in government subsidies than the poorest American families. I'm sorry, what? These are just a few of the shocking revelations about poverty found in Matthew Desmond's new bestseller, Poverty by America. Let's talk about a few more. First, America's poverty problem is huge. Seriously. According to Matthew, if America's poor founded a country, that country would have a bigger population than Australia or Venezuela. Consider these facts. Almost 1 in 9 Americans, including 1 in 8 children, live in poverty. More than 38 million people living in the United States cannot afford their basic necessities. Over 5 million American children are living in deep poverty, which is defined as anything under half the current poverty level, which means we're talking about kids living in families that make less than $13,000 a year for a family of 4. Over 5 million Americans are considered absolutely poor by global standards. This is insane. Next, let's talk about something even more infuriating. Most of America's social support goes to the wealthy. According to Matthew, if you count all public benefits offered by the federal government, America's welfare state, as a share of its GDP, is the second biggest in the world after France's. But that's only true if you include things like government-subsidized retirement benefits provided by employers, student loans and 529 college savings plans, child tax credits, and homeowner subsidies. Benefits disproportionately flowing to Americans well above the poverty line. Specifically, he points out that employer-sponsored healthcare plans and retirement benefits are usually only available to those with great jobs. The mortgage interest deduction only helps those who can afford a house or 2, and bigger mortgages equal bigger tax breaks. Those 529 plans only help you if you can afford to save for your kid's college fund. These are not programs that help the poor. That may not sound like a big deal, but let's talk about the numbers. Matthew wrote, altogether, the United States spent $1.8 trillion on tax breaks in 2021. That amount exceeded total spending on law enforcement, education, housing, healthcare, diplomacy, and everything else that makes up our discretionary budget. In 2020, the federal government spent $193 billion on homeowner subsidies and just $53 billion on housing assistance for low-income families. That's almost 4 times more money set aside for the wealthy. And that's not the only way that this doesn't make sense. Mortgage deductions last for the life of the mortgage, usually 30 years. Whereas cash assistance for the poor has a 5-year lifetime limit, there is a lot of inequality here. And according to Matthew's research, the families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution receive about $25,733 a year in government benefits. But the wealthy in the top 20% receive about $35,363. That's about $10,000 more, or in other words, 40% more in government subsidies than the low-income families received. And that's not even as outrageous as our next point. The government regularly misuses the money set aside to help low-income families. America is spending more money than ever, but most of that money isn't making it where it needs to go. In fact, out of the $31.6 billion in welfare funding, just $7.1 billion was realized as dollars in hand relief to the poor. For example, TANF was restructured during the Clinton presidency. Before the change, almost all TANF dollars were sent as cash assistance directly to single-parent families. But after the change, states could choose how to spend that grant money. And as a result, only 22 cents out of every TANF dollar is given as cash assistance to low-income families. Now that's a nationwide average. Some states do better, others do worse. Matthew tracked down how some of those TANF dollars were spent, and some of it went to childcare and supporting job training, which is great. But some of it went to some really questionable stuff. For example, a 389-page audit of the state of Mississippi's Department of Human Services found that the state had used the TANF money for some really sketchy stuff, including $1.3 million for a 12-week fitness camp that state legislators could attend for free, $1.1 million for an NFL quarterback to give speeches that were never actually given, $5 million in donations to the University of Southern Mississippi so they could build a wellness center, and $2.1 million to a ministry run by the father of the department's deputy administrator. But at least Mississippi actually spent the money. States aren't actually required to spend all of their TANF money every year, so a lot of that money sits around unspent in state accounts. States were holding almost $6 billion in unspent welfare funds in 2020, and some of the states that were holding the most also had the highest rates of poverty. Matthew wrote, Nebraska was sitting on $91 million. Hawaii had $380 million, enough to provide every poor child in the state with $10,000. Tennessee topped the list with $790 million. That year, only 9 states in the Union had a higher child poverty rate than Tennessee. No state had a child poverty rate higher than Mississippi's at roughly 28%, which is also the child poverty rate of Costa Rica. And don't forget, that's Mississippi, the same state that spent all those millions of dollars on things other than helping low-income families. I guess some of the reason that states have so much unspent money sitting around is because a lot of people aren't using the programs they're eligible for. It turns out that welfare dependency isn't really that much of a thing. If you dig into the data, you quickly realize that the problem isn't welfare dependency, but welfare avoidance, wrote Matthew. Simply put, many poor families don't take advantage of the aid that's available to them. Only 1/4 of families who qualify for TANF apply for it. Less than half of elderly Americans who qualify for food stamps sign up to receive them. 1 in 5 parents eligible for government health insurance do not enroll, just as 1 in 5 workers who qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit do not claim it. At the height of the Great Recession, 1 in 10 Americans was out of work, but only 1 in 3 of those drew unemployment. That's a lot of unused benefits. In fact, Matthew estimates that low-income people walk away from $142 billion in collective unused aid every year. That's because 7 million people ignore the Earned Income Tax Credit every year, leaving $17.3 billion on the table. When you add that to the money unclaimed by people who don't apply for food stamps, government health insurance programs, unemployment insurance, and supplemental security income, it adds up to $142 billion, and that's not including any other programs that are underutilized, like LIHEAP. That's a lot. So why? Why are so many people walking away from these programs that could help them? The bulk of the evidence indicates that low-income Americans are not taking advantage of government programs because we've made it hard and confusing, concluded Matthew, and he's not wrong about that. After running low-income relief for 10 years, I can tell you the programs are much harder and much more confusing than they need to be. That's literally why I'm here trying to explain them to you guys every week. Because there is a lot of legalese and a lot of loopholes and a lot of nonsense in these programs. As Matthew found, less than 1/3 of new disability applications are approved on the first application. It's not uncommon to have to apply multiple times in order to get assistance. Most SSI applications are rejected the first time. The programs are complicated, the applications are long and tedious, and often they require a lot of paperwork that is hard to gather. America just makes it hard to get help. And even when you apply for something you're qualified for, it's not always a guarantee you're going to get it. Matthew reported that the federal government provides housing assistance to only 1 in 4 of the families who qualify for it. That's outrageous. And one of the most discouraging things to me was that work doesn't solve it. Matthew's book is full of stories of struggling Americans who are working multiple jobs and still can't get ahead. Consider Julio, who was working 80 hours a week at his 2 full-time jobs in 2014. He worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. at McDonald's, slept for 2 hours, then clocked in at Aerotech from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Both jobs paid minimum wage, leaving him barely able to afford the single unfurnished room he shared with his mother and 2 siblings. He literally fainted in the grocery store when he was 24 because it was not physically possible to work hard enough to provide for himself and his family. As Matthew observed, Julio didn't have to be paid poverty wages. If he manned the grill at a McDonald's in Denmark, his paycheck would have been double what it was in Emeryville. Matthew presents a very compelling case for raising the minimum wage in his book, but for now I'm just going to quote this one section. Work is not what keeps scores of low-paid Americans from plunging into deep poverty. The government is. It's the government that helps these families access health care through Medicaid, that helps them eat with food stamps, and that boosts their incomes through the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Government Accountability Office recently analyzed data from 11 states and found that roughly 12 million American workers relied on Medicaid for their health insurance, and 9 million lived in homes receiving food stamps. That's only in 11 states, guys! Most of the workers enrolled in each program worked full-time for part of the year. Roughly half worked full-time year-round. In 2020, 1 in 17 Food Lion workers in North Carolina drew on food stamps. Almost 1 in 10 Stop and Shop employees in Massachusetts was enrolled in Medicaid, as was nearly 1 in 7 Oklahomans who worked at Dollar General. It is really concerning to me that so many workers have to supplement their incomes with government programs like this. Who is really winning here? And that's the thing that honestly pisses me off the most. America could totally fix this. The United States could effectively end poverty in America tomorrow without increasing the deficit if it cracked down on corporations and families who cheat on their taxes, reallocating the newfound revenue to those most in need of it, Matthew wrote. Instead, we let the rich slide and give the most to those who have plenty already, creating a welfare state that heavily favors the upper class. And then our elected officials have the audacity, the shamelessness really, to fabricate stories about poor people's dependency on government aid and shoot down proposals to reduce poverty because they would cost too much. Glancing at the price tag of some program that would cut child poverty in half or give all Americans access to a doctor, they suck their teeth and ask, "But how could we afford it?" How could we afford it? What a sinful question. What a selfish, dishonest question, one asked as if the answer wasn't staring us straight in the face. We could afford it if the well-off among us took less from the government. We could afford it if we designed our welfare state to expand opportunity and not guard fortunes. That was a quote from the book. It's one of my favorites. Matthew goes on to explain that it would take about $177 billion to lift everyone in America to the poverty line in 2020. That is less than 1% of our GDP. Americans collectively throw away more than that amount in food every year. According to Matthew, what could $177 billion buy? Quite a lot. We could ensure that every person in America had a safer and more affordable place to live. Every single one of us. We could put a real dent in ending homelessness in America, and we could end hunger. We could provide every child with a fairer shot at security and success. We could make immense headway in driving down the many agonizing correlates of poverty, like violence, sickness, and despair. Crime rates would plummet, eviction rates too. Neighborhoods would stabilize and come alive. Schools could focus more on education instead of dedicating so many resources to triaging the deep needs of their students. Since the IRS estimates that more than $1 trillion a year is lost to tax cheaters, it seems very attainable to find $177 billion to solve poverty. But will America do it? I don't know, honestly. I hope so. Matthew's book is a bestseller now. And I hope you'll share this video and bring more awareness to this, because poverty is a solvable problem. It is an unnecessary evil. And so much of what Matthew revealed in this book is heartbreakingly, infuriatingly wrong, and it needs to be fixed. But I know I'm preaching to the choir, and I know you know that better than anyone. So please share this video. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because I'll be back on Saturday with more low-income assistance programs that can help you. I'll see you there.